Kelly Sexton, and then Agnes, I missed it, Agnes Sevenstedt, the co-founder and director of Innovation 360 Group. So without further ado, let me kindly pass the floor to Mr. David Gill. We're looking forward to your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope everybody can hear me. Good. Well, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. My day job is running the St. John's Innovation Centre here in Cambridge, which is a business incubator that's been around since 1987 and has grown and grown. We're also members of the European Business Network, and a couple of hours ago you were hearing from David T. Everything he says about being able to benchmark yourself with your peer group is true and very, very helpful for us as practitioners. But in my 20 minutes today, I wanted to take a step back. So instead of sharing with you some of the what, the best practices, the things we do, I wanted to go back 2 steps and think about the why. Why do we value innovation ecosystems? Why do we all want to work in this area of activity? And I think to do so, you need a little bit of history to understand where the concept came from. And then using that history, perhaps we can have a sense of where we're going with it. Ecosystem, whether it's entrepreneurial or innovative or business or innovation district, a term which tends to be used and abused a great deal. The earliest use of the term that I've been able to come across, as so often in social sciences, actually came in the physical sciences. And this was in 1935, a publication by Sir Arthur Tansley, talking about ecosystems in the sense of how they appear in nature. So this would be thinking about anything from a jungle, a forest, a natural habitat. He defined it very widely. And useful as the term is, and familiar as we all are with it these days, it took about 60 years before the term ecosystem had been adopted by the social sciences, by people in economics and business. Many of you will be aware that economics in the 19th century economics in the 19th century and early 20th century was often based on physics and mechanical engineering. So I think in many ways it was a great advantage that this new concept of a business ecosystem had been adopted from something which was much more fluid, much more dynamic, much more creative, the world of agriculture and the natural world. So James Moore's article in the Harvard Business Review was the first time I could come across this term used in the context of business. On the other hand, as you might expect, the concept behind the word goes back a lot further. And the famous economist from the end of the 19th century, Alfred Marshall, had been a pioneer in the understanding of clustering. What was interesting about Marshall's understanding was that he tended to think of locations where people came together as being ones where they all share the same trade. He analyzed, for instance, the clusters where a lot of clothing was made, a lot of steel was made, the early days of the manufacturing of the motor car, that kind of thing. And he came up with this famous phrase that the mysteries of the trade become no mysteries because they are, as it were, in the air. And what he meant by that is one of the great advantages of, let's say you are 2 car manufacturers. If you locate next door to each other, you can share so many fundamental values, you can share training, you can share staff, you can share the services of people like specialist lawyers. On the other hand, I think for understanding modern ecosystems, it was the thought that Jane Jacobs, an American microeconomist, came up with in the 1960s, that the wonderful thing about places like cities is the extent to which different sectors come together, and a specialism which you've acquired in one area can be spread to another area. I definitely see that in my day job. Here in the St. John's Innovation Centre, We normally have anything from 70 to 80 companies on site. And quite often we have companies that are have nothing apparently to do with each other. We might have people who do software debugging as well as people who do radio frequency identification. The people who've done the software debugging might have had to solve a really difficult problem, such as how to reorganize a team. And the great magic of being co-located here is they can help the people who are operating in completely different sectors, whether it's nanotech or graphene or whatever it may be. So I think those two insights matter enormously. As many of you probably know, that the concept of a cluster was popularized in the 1990s, first by Annalise Saxenian, who compared Silicon Valley with Boston in Massachusetts, and also by Michael Porter, a professor at Harvard Business School, who became very big in consulting in this area. But to move the argument on, what I've been trying to do, because in this short session today, I wanted to provide you with a conceptual framework. I've had the pleasure over the years of working with a number of academics who've studied what clusters are. And Eric Stam from the University of Utrecht came here to lecture a few years back when he was pioneering his original work, defining what an entrepreneurial ecosystem is. And I think what he came up with is fairly basic but fairly clear. It's the interdependent actors and factors who come together in such a way as to produce things which are of value. What I particularly like about his writing was he was concerned both with what goes in that black box at the bottom of my slide there, in other words, all the components you need, and he was trying to come up with what is the recipe of how you use those components together. But he's one of the few people who's actually thought about, why do we collectively worry about innovation ecosystems? And the answer is because they enable us to create new value for society. And that value isn't just economic. It's the value of being able to transform people's lives through drug discovery, through low carbon applications, through food efficiency. If it hadn't been for the green food revolution in the 1960s, we wouldn't be able to feed today's world population. On the other hand, if I move the argument on very quickly, I think that a lot of the academic literature has been light on what actually goes on within that black box. Once you've got all the components, how do you make them work together? If I pick up the story at a critical point in the 1990s, a lot of people involved in developing innovation ecosystems would probably one way or another have followed the template that James Gibbons from Stanford used. I had the pleasure of attending one of his lectures when he was here in Cambridge in 1997. And I've summarized that lecture here on the board. What Professor Gibbons was looking for back in the 1990s would have been typical of many people at the time. He was thinking about what you might call the input factors, what you could think of as being the hardware. Many of these factors we've talked about over the course of today already. It's undeniably true that you need universities. Of course, you need strong entrepreneurs. You need risk finance of the type that angels and venture funds provide. And you need supportive infrastructure, such as business incubators and science parks. The one I've added is culture, and we'll be spending a bit more time talking about that in a moment. But the more I've been doing this job, the more I've come to see that simply having the input factors on their own isn't enough. You've got to have a much better idea of things to do with the input factors once you've got them. And the best summary of things you do with input factors that I've ever come across was another famous article in the Harvard Business Review, this time by Daniel Eisenberg 10 years ago, talking about the general lessons of making tech clusters work. One of the things that he particularly focused on was that the ultimate aim of a cluster is to enable high potential companies to grow. It isn't about activity. It isn't about having hundreds and hundreds of startups. It's about being able to make those companies which have the highest potential to become big, to develop their products on a world scale, do that faster, quicker, better. And that's why people like us exist. That's why people who consult on innovation ecosystems, people who run science parks, that's why we have a job. That's why we get up in the morning. One of the big lessons from Daniel Eisenberg is that we have to stop trying to copy each other. We can learn from each other, but we can't copy each other. And in particular, places that have been around for a long time, like Silicon Valley, are very, very bad role models for new innovation ecosystems. In recent years, I've worked with development agencies in Libya, trying to build an innovation ecosystem. I'm working with Bangkok in Thailand at the moment. And the first thing I have to say to them is, by all means, come and study what we do here in Cambridge or what happens in Silicon Valley, but don't try and copy it directly because it will never read across. Moving on very quickly, one of the most influential books in the past decade, I think, about what makes innovation ecosystems works was the Rainforest by Hwang and Horowitz that came out in, I think, 2012. Their fundamental concept was that you should never mistake what succeeds in an innovation ecosystem for the old-fashioned factory type model. Factories are more like plantations where you get serried ranks of trees, everything is predictable and precise and so forth. Whereas the most fertile, the most productive places are more like a rainforest, and they survive on creative chaos. Deep down, I believe in the values that the rainforest seeks to promote, and I hope that in the St. John's Innovation Centre on a regular basis, we do this every day. We try to instill these values and behaviours on the entrepreneurs on site, particularly, for instance, the idea of paying it forward. Every entrepreneur, and I include myself, has received huge amounts of help from previous generations. We can never really pay back the individuals. So the only way that we can make that come good is to pay it forward to the next generation. So these were a summary of the behaviors and the values by which you should live in an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I do buy into that, but I still think there's something missing if we want to understand what really happens, and it's this. Not only is it the case of, is ecosystem the right term, but so much of the literature, particularly professional literature, has left out the role of government. And it was Lord Sainsbury, who was the science minister in the UK for 7 years and is the chancellor of the Cambridge University, who's been a very influential thinker as well as actor in this field, who pointed out the role of government. No matter how successful entrepreneurs are, you can never really grow an innovation ecosystem unless you're addressing the big picture as well, whether that's the enforcement of the rule of law, rule of contract, taxation, specialist grants for research and development, priming a venture capital industry. Never ignore the role of government. Government can't pick winners, but government can frame the conditions. And almost finally, ladies and gentlemen, I come to some work by the former head of the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts here in the United Kingdom, Jeff Mulgan. And I would pick out just a couple of his research findings. The first one is that simply creating an innovation ecosystem isn't enough. We collectively have to do a lot, a bit like responsible gardeners, to make sure that it is curated. In other words, it carries on thriving. Secondly, I think that so many halfway successful or even very successful innovation ecosystems tend to be too much more like forms of propaganda and aren't honest with themselves about their shortcomings. And I'd like to wind up with 1 minute talking about the shortcomings of Cambridge, where I'm sitting now, which in many ways has been very successful, but probably needs to be a bit more honest with itself about what happens next. As those of you who visited here will know, there's really 2 Cambridges. There's the medieval college town, and then there's the thriving, dynamic innovation world. And I'm sitting right in the middle of the left-hand side of that picture at the moment. Over the years, Cambridge undoubtedly does deserve some of its success. It's produced many Nobel Prize winners. It's produced many spin-outs which have been valued at $5, $10, $15 billion in a very short space of time. But I would argue the thing that's made Cambridge exceptional has been that sense of contributing to society, that sense of having a mission, as opposed to simply having an activity and wanting to be famous or rich or otherwise successful in a worldly sense of that term. So if I summarize by using Cambridge simply as a case study, not as an example, on the one hand, if I come back to Eric Stamm's breakdown of the things you need, over the years, we've been very good at building up the framework conditions. We've been very, very good at having a sense of mission. In other words, the new value creation, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of the impact on society. But our shortcoming has been one which I don't see elsewhere in the world, which is we're very bad at strategic thinking. We're very bad at addressing the issues about how we're going to build the infrastructure for the future. And I think if it hadn't been for the pandemic slowing down activity here this year, 2020 would have been a crunch year for Cambridge, because we are running out of houses for entrepreneurs to live in. We are running out of schools for their children to go to. We are running out of incubators and science parks. So we are the victims of our own success. And unless and until around here we can think more strategically, the fact that we've been good or lucky with having a mission and building up so many successful companies worth billions over the years is likely to be in jeopardy. So that's the thought I'd like to leave you with. I hope I've been in time. Thank you very much indeed. And I shall now stop sharing screen.
Thank you so much, David. It's a very concise presentation.